Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Ask the Expert, creating bird-friendly spaces in Atlanta City and the Forest. We're so glad you're here with us today. This is a program that we're really excited to partner with Birds Georgia on. My name is Elizabeth Beek. I coordinate education programs here at Trees Atlanta. I'm here today with two incredible colleagues, one being Quinn, who is going to help me with some of the Q&A today, and then also Colin, who I will introduce in a few minutes. For those of you all who are not familiar with Trees Atlanta, Trees Atlanta's mission is to protect and improve the urban forest, and we do this through planting projects throughout the city. We do this through conservation or forest restoration programs, and we also do this through education programs such as today. And you can learn more about how you can get involved in any of these aspects of the organization by going to our website. And then our partners at Birds Georgia, their mission is to build places where birds and people thrive through conservation, education, and community engagement. And I invite you to check out all the beautiful work they are doing at their website. Both of our organizations would love to thank the City of Atlanta for sponsoring today's presentation and sponsoring so many of the urban forest education programs that we have. And for today's presentation, I'm just going to ask that everybody keep themselves on mute. If you have any questions for the presenters today, I invite you to drop it into the comments, and Quinn and I will be gathering all your amazing questions and then asking those questions to our experts at the end of today's presentation. And if for any reason we run out of time, we will follow up with the answer in writing, and we will also have a recording of today's presentation on our YouTube. And then also something that's really, really helpful for all of us on the education team is we will be sending you out a survey after, and we would love your feedback. We're always trying to figure out ways we can improve our programming and better serve you all. This program is part of a series of programs that are really connected to what we can do to the urban forest that can also be great for wildlife. So we'll be having a similar virtual program with our friends at the Amphibian Foundation in a couple weeks called Creating Amphibian-Friendly Spaces in Our City and the Forest. And then all three of our organizations invite you to come and join us out in the fields at Clyde Shepherd Nature Preserve. And we're going to be checking out everything from the forest floor to our canopy and really celebrating some of the things that we speak about during our virtual programs. And then we have a great Georgia Arbor Month presenter coming in on February 7th. Is Dr. Doug Tellamy, and he is going to be sharing more information about the National Homegrown National Park movement and what an impact this can have. And all of our partners, including Birds Georgia, with their certification program and also their stewardship track with us, the Amphibian Foundation and others will be there with resources. One of the great things that we're going to learn about a little bit today is the impact we can all have with creating bird-friendly spaces in our own yards. Gabe, I'm sure, is going to talk on Birds Georgia's Wildlife Sanctuary Certification Program, our City Forest Certification Program. Colin's going to speak to, and we have a bird stewardship track. We try to work together. So if you are being certified in one of our programs, the other one is as well. And by putting these up in your yards, it's really inspiring for your neighbors, and they're going to be curious and do things in their own yard as well. You can find out more about ways you can get involved with both Birds Georgia and Trees Atlanta by signing up for our newsletters, following us on social media, and just checking out our websites. But for now, I'm really excited to introduce you to our experts. We've got Gabe, who's Director of Conservation at Birds Georgia. So his title has been updated as of this year. And he oversees lots of habitat management, restoration, and native plant work. He came to Atlanta first for Emory University and has a great deal of knowledge and experience in ecology conservation and is a wonderful educator. I encourage you to check him out with Nature with Gabe. And then I'm going to just quickly, before I turn it over to Gabe, introduce you to also Colin, who's my wonderful colleague. He's the education senior lead in both the youth education team and the adult education, gets the honor of getting to work with him. And he really does so much of the beautiful work with our City Forest certification program. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to our expert, Gabe.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and get started here. All right, I believe everybody should be able to see my screen at this point and see the first slide in my presentation, creating bird-friendly spaces. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I Thanks for the introduction, Beak. I'm so glad to be partnering with Trees Atlanta. I think there's so much we can do together to support our forests and our birds at the same time. And I think there's no better way to do this than working in your backyard, if you have a backyard, or your local green spaces, and working on getting them certified, getting them recognized. Um, when I started with Birds Georgia several years ago, I started managing our sanctuary program, so it's very near and dear to my heart. And yeah, a lot of the things that I've learned from practicing a lot of these things that allow birds and wildlife to thrive in these green spaces are things that help inform a lot of our habitat work on much larger scales across the state. And so, yeah, I'm really, really looking forward to chatting with you all today and telling you more about this work. So, Georgia is an incredible place for birds. From the mountains to the coast, we have this amazing variety of habitats. Up in the mountains, we get some of the southern ranges of breeding songbirds, and in the state, such as the Canada warbler, which is the bird that you see in the middle of the screen. They breed up at Brasstown Bald. Um, and then down on the coast, we have an amazing variety of birds. It's the birdiest place in the state, such as the long-billed curlew that you see. Um, and that on the right side of the screen. And then here in the Piedmont, where Atlanta is, we also have an incredible diversity of birds, especially that are passing through during migration. We have some incredible birds from the tropics that breed here, such as the summer tanager that you see on the left side of the screen. And yeah, so it's really an amazing place due to the variety of habitats and even when you take a step closer and, just are concentrating on urban areas in Atlanta. So if you're a birder, you might be familiar with eBird. If you're not, it's an amazing resource through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that allows people to record what birds they're seeing and submit checklists to help people monitor bird populations. And there are hotspots where you can go and look for birds and see what other people have been seeing. And there's a hotspot, of course, at Piedmont Park. And there's been 186 species documented at Piedmont Park. There's over 400 bird species that have been documented in the state. So it's nearly half the species that have been documented in Georgia have almost been seen at Piedmont Park. So it just goes to show that birds are using these spaces in a variety of ways, and these spaces can be critically important for birds. Um, and you know, I think today, I really want to highlight the fact that you can have a space as big as Piedmont Park and see 186 bird species, but you could also have a spot that's as small as an eighth of an acre. One of our members who lives in Athens, in kind of downtown Athens, has been working on improving his very small backyard space for birds and has documented over 150 bird species just from that tiny little yard, which is absolutely mind-blowing, and just goes to show how much of an impact you can have and how much you can, how these small things can add up to make a difference and allow you to see incredible things. Actually, So yeah, this gentleman who has been certified through our wildlife sanctuary program was featured on our virtual wildlife sanctuary tour during the pandemic. So I made a video. You can check that out on our Birds Georgia YouTube page. I also made a video on my personal YouTube page, just highlighting his backyard because it really is that special. I saw my very first ever Nashville warbler in his yard. Nashville warbler's up there in the top left part of the screen with the gray head, the white eye-ring, and the yellow belly. Um, so there's bird I'd never seen before in my life, and I saw it in his yard for the first time. And so, he has done a lot of the things that we'll be diving into today to make a space more hospitable for birds, and not just for birds, but for other wildlife. And yeah, it's pretty amazing. So, to give an outline of the Birds Georgia Wildlife Sanctuary Program, there's several things I want to highlight. First, you don't have to have a huge space and you don't have to certify your entire yard at one time. You can start with a space as small as 50 square feet and work from there. This makes it a little bit more feasible for people who might be limited or who might be dealing with certain plants that are very difficult to deal with, etc. And some of the main requirements for our sanctuary program are less than 50% monoculture turf grass. Lawns are not great for wildlife. Less than 25% non-native invasive plants, at least 50% or more native plants, some structural diversity, and then some safe wildlife practices that we'll kind of go into later. But yeah, you can apply on our website and learn more. We have a really great resources page to allow people to learn more and get connected. We also have a newsletter that goes out that you can sign up for that highlights properties and talks about different plants and this and that. But yeah, when you're certified, you get that sign over there on the right, and doing what you can to show your neighbors and your community that you are doing something intentional for birds and wildlife. Is so important. I think can really go a long way. So yeah, at its core, working to make a space bird friendly and getting a place to be certified, become a sanctuary, get it, it really comes down to birdscaping in a way. And birdscaping is landscaping for birds. It's intentionally attracting and supporting birds in a green space by providing them with essential resources. So we're trying to get in the bird's head and think about what do they need, what makes them comfortable, and kind of go from there. So it includes a variety of things from habitat restoration and management, rewilding, native scaping, bird feeding, water features, and safe wildlife practices. And we're going to go over a bunch of that today. And, birdscaping, wildscaping, whatever you want to call it, really does an amazing job of connecting you to nature. I think it's one of the best ways to cultivate kind of a conservation culture in our communities. And it is, making nature as accessible as possible. You can do a whole bunch right in your backyard, right outside your door, right in your local park to support wildlife. And it's great for your mental wellness and well-being. There's just like endless learning that can happen when you have these things happening, right in your backyard where you can observe these changes every single day and you can notice things and ask questions and you can get involved. There's so many different community science opportunities that can come from working in a local green space, whether you're doing a Christmas bird count or a pollinator count or working on getting certified. And then ultimately, the conservation impact is certainly there. There's some of the species that people are documenting in their yards are species that are at risk or declining. And so yeah, the potential is there, and the more we can connect habitat and get other people inspired and connected and interested, the more habitat we can build, and that creates resiliency on the landscape. And there's so much more, especially in our urban areas, when it comes to combating, some of the implications of climate change. There's really a lot that can happen from birdscaping and wildscaping. And so, yeah, it's about embracing nature's way of doing things with intentionality and specific guidance. But at the end of the day, it's good for all those reasons, but also it's really important for the birds because unfortunately birds are declining. We've lost about 3 billion birds over the past 50 years, so that's 1 in 4 birds have disappeared across the North American landscape over that 50 years. So a net population decrease of 3 billion birds, which is pretty scary. And that really goes to show why I think it's essential to find what we can do at home and really create a community that's interested and inspired and doing their part because the birds definitely need their help. And actually, if we take a closer look at the study that came out in 2019 documenting this loss. Two of the main drivers are habitat loss and habitat degradation. So not only losing habitat, but the habitat that we do have is degrading. And so that means that every little bit of habitat can make a difference. And so no matter how small of a green space you're working with, it can be significant when it's combined and scaled up with other folks. And it's not just about the birds too. I think part of the exciting part is getting to notice some of the other wildlife that's using the space. There's so many different pollinators that are at risk as well, and there's a lot we can do to help them too. But with this paper that came out in 2019, it documented this huge decrease in birds, but there were some groups of birds that were increasing in population. That's woodpeckers, raptors, waterfowl, and all of those increases could be pretty much tied to conservation actions. And so that shows that, we can make a difference and we can be intentional about the actions that we take, and it can have positive results. And so, I'm really hopeful that a lot of the migratory bird species that are declining, a lot of the grassland bird species, if we build more pocket prairies in our backyards and increase the amount of food sources for these birds as they're migrating across the landscape, we can start to see positive impacts on some of these birds that are declining. All right, so now I'm just going to go over an introduction of some of the stuff that we'll be diving into a little bit further. Um, when we're thinking about birdscaping, we are first want to take a step back and think about where we are. So we're going to talk about scale and location. We're going to think about what it means to be wild, because that's really important in making birds comfortable. We're going to talk about reducing lawns, embracing dead wood on the landscape, how water can be beneficial for birds and other wildlife. We're going to talk about native plants, removing non-native plants, and maintaining the landscapes that we're cultivating and stewarding. So yeah, first, thinking about context, location, and scale can be really beneficial because the landscapes across Georgia, like I mentioned at the beginning, are really diverse and special and unique. But there's so much nuance, not only between these large ecoregions that you see on this map, but just from one side of a hill to the other. You can have completely different plant communities on the north side of a hill versus the south side of a hill. And so taking a step back and thinking about your green space, where you are, your backyard, your local park, and thinking about, am I at the bottom of a hill or the top of a hill? Is my yard facing west, north, east? What's the light like in my yard? Thinking about the past history of your landscape. Are you in an area that was heavily disturbed or farmed at one point? Was your yard used for something else? When they went and built your house originally, did they just scrape the land clean, or do you potentially have some old growth soils in your yard? Thinking of all these things can be really important to start to allow you to best implement different things to restore and improve your landscape and think about what plants you might want to plant in those spaces as well. And I think it's important to highlight, yeah, that emulating your immediate landscape is most aligned with rewilding principles and may have conservation benefits. So what does that mean? Well, really thinking about your yard or your green space and thinking of it as a small part of a very, very large landscape, and trying to do your best to blend it into that space appropriately. So yeah, for example, if you are on the top of a ridge somewhere and you're thinking about what plants you want to plant, it might not be the best idea to plant sweet gums and river oats and cardinal flower, these plants that are really bottomland species that would most appropriately be growing down in a floodplain or a riparian habitat. Because plants are on the landscape and existing in a certain place, because they're going to do better that way. You're going to have better success cultivating those plants, but also the wildlife that uses these spaces is going to be looking for those plants in those specific places. So it's not like it's not you know, a perfect kind of world. Obviously, like we are living in a super urban area where things are sort of out of place in some ways, and it's not to say you can't try to emulate different habitat types in your yard, but you are only going to be, in a place for a certain amount of time, and these landscapes are going to exist long past when we're here. And so, doing our best to align our habitat management and our yards to fit well within the context of the landscape that they're a part of. Can be really beneficial for wildlife and for kind of long-term management of different sites. And I want to mention the Natural Communities of Georgia. This is a great, great resource. So there is a book, a huge book that dives into the different natural communities. And if you're not familiar with these, I think it's a great resource. There's also a website that covers a couple of the ecoregions in the state, including the Piedmont region. And so it can be very, very helpful to reference and start to get an idea of, where do you fit within the landscape and maybe what kind of plants should I be thinking about. So I think that's yeah, really beneficial resource. And now when we're birdscaping, birds are most comfortable in wild spaces that are not super maintained or cultivated or clean. And so that's not to say we can't have spaces where we keep things somewhat clean or orderly and tidy, but I think we want to try to lean a little bit more into the wild side. And kind of rethink maybe some of the traditional ideas of what a beautiful landscape might seem like, and try and, yeah, realign our beauty standards with the natural landscapes and try and get inspiration from them. So the picture I have here is over in Augusta, Georgia, Augusta National, and obviously, like, this is a lot of people view the golf course is absolutely beautiful, and it is in some ways, but it might not necessarily be the best thing for birds. So instead of seeking inspiration from places like that are heavily altered, I think it can be really impactful to just go around your local green spaces and see what they look like, spaces that aren't heavily managed. So this is a picture from Fernbank Forest. So if you walk out into Fernbank Forest, something that stands out is like, oh yeah, nobody's out there leaf blowing other than the pathways and the trails. And so, naturally, people or landscapes, you leave the leaves on the ground, and what are the implications of that, and how can we incorporate those ideas into our gardens or green spaces? And think about, what tree species are here. Go to your local park and see, what tree species are growing and where are they growing, and how is that similar or different from your backyard? Um, and yeah, like I said, keeping materials on site is really important. So that's not only the leaves, but if you have dead wood on your landscape, we'll talk about that further later, but that's really, really valuable. Including layers of habitat is really good, especially if you're trying to attract a multitude of bird species, because birds are going to be more or less comfortable depending on what species, having a variety of layers. And maybe you have a front yard where it's very open, and keeping it open can be really beneficial in supporting kind of grassland or open country birds. Maybe your backyard's very forested and you want to keep it that way. So yeah, it's important to think about and gain inspiration from some of these spaces. Um, and I also wanted to mention thinking about disturbance on the landscape. So, disturbance is an important natural part of our landscapes and shapes some of the diversity that we see across the state. And that's things like prescribed fire or fire on the landscape is a natural part of almost all of the communities in Georgia. And so, obviously, in our urban spaces, we can't necessarily be burning everything as great as it would be for wildlife. And so, how can we mimic fire on the landscape? Are there things we can do? If you have very specific mowing, if you have a small prairie that can kind of mimic a burn, storms and herbivores shaped our landscape in many ways and still do. So thinking about, yeah, how are the deer affecting your backyard and what you can do about that, and are there certain plants that might be missing that you might want to try to cultivate in some way because of the effect of herbivores. Um, and then the last thing, while we're embracing the wild side, we also want to keep other folks comfortable and interested when necessary. So we, you know, as great as keeping things super wild is for wildlife, we, don't want to get too much flack from our neighbors about having the yard that is just a complete mess. Um, and and I think there's, a lot there. There's education that I think can happen, and showing cues of care is really important. So what I mean by cues of care is showing intentionality with your green space. So getting your yard certified, putting a yard sign up, spending time in your yard, maintaining it, and when people walk by, engaging with them and talking about what you're doing. Um, and then also things like what's it called? Here in this picture, creating intentionality in your space. So you can have a lot of wild stuff, but maybe you're using logs that have fallen or sticks that have fallen in your yard to line pathways. Showing clear borders and edges can be a way to show intentionality in a space and allow for there to be some wild chaos that's going to make the birds and the insects more comfortable. And so, yeah, that's something that I think is really valuable to think about. And this can be done in so many different ways. Here's another great example of a yard that has used um, a bunch of native grasses and planted them in such a way where you have this big patch of little blue stem, you have this big patch of river oats, you have a big patch of Cherokee sedge, and there's some big blue stem in the background. And it looks orderly, it looks intentional, and it's providing habitat for grassland birds and other wildlife. And so there's a lot of different ways to show intentionality and signs of care. And I think that is really something to think about, in spaces where people have an idea of landscapes that have been kind of just things that they grew up with, or just thought of as beautiful because it's the way people have done things for a while. And so, yeah, when we are trying to embrace the wild side, it's important to focus on these small things to win people over and not get the city called on you and get reported and all the difficulties that some of us face when we're trying to do this stuff. But there's a lot of small things I think that can go a long way. So lawns are the worst. Yeah. Lawns are not great for wildlife, and so we are huge advocates of minimizing your lawn or removing your lawn. Couple things to think about with mowing is seeing if you can mow less, or if you're, moving into a space, just stopping mowing and seeing what's growing there can be very beneficial because sometimes we have native plants in some of our Atlanta, many of our Atlanta backyards and front yards that are growing in amongst non-native grasses, and allowing these plants to grow up and identify them can be really exciting. It can be an opportunity to cultivate these plants and grow more of them. And mowing outside of nesting season, I'll mention is definitely something that can be beneficial to birds and decrease disturbance. Um, and so, yeah, come, April through July, really, doing minimal amounts of mowing or maybe only mowing parts of your lawn can be helpful. And yeah, you never know what's going to pop up. If you stop mowing, you can start identifying plants. The picture on the far right is Rudbeckia fulgida, orange coneflower that I let my lawn grow up and realized I had that species growing. And so I started mowing around it and allowed it to flower, and insects were using the flowers. And then it went to seed. I collected some of the seed and started propagating it. And so, yeah, kind of working with lawns, mowing less, seeing what's there are all ways to start to make lawns a little bit more helpful. And then, yeah, you can also minimize the lawn. So bit by bit, you can remove the lawn using a variety of techniques to increase opportunities for other native plantings and provide different types of habitat. Um, and at the end of the day, if you have to keep your lawn, letting it grow up and go to seed um, can still sometimes help certain species of bird and insect, as long as you don't have any species that are going to be very invasive, because that's something that you want to keep an eye on and minimize when possible. Um, what else do we have here? Yeah, we mentioned leaving the leaves. Yeah, another thing is bare soil is also actually really important for certain insects and for birds when they are dust bathing. So you don't have to have a perfect lawn or yard with, everything covered in green. Having little nooks and crannies for the wildlife to use, I think is really, really important. So yeah, here's an example of minimizing the lawn. You don't have to do much. You can start small and go from there. So here's a mailbox, and we removed some of the turf grass around the mailbox, put some logs around the edge. Those logs, helping enrich the soil as they break down, and there might be different fungi and insects that can use those. Put some leaf litter on top to act as a mulch to minimize some of the winter weeds that come in, and plant some native plants. And then in the spring and summer, you've got Coreopsis and Stokes aster and common bone set there, providing great resources for pollinators, attracting insects, which are going to attract the birds. We've got a little pokeweed growing up in the crack between the road and the curb, and we're gonna let that grow up and let that provide some fruit for migratory birds and some of our resident birds, and through the spring into the fall. And so there's a lot that can be done with a small space, and chipping away at little tiny bits and pieces of lawn, whether that's a little mailbox garden or bigger portions of your yard, can have a positive impact. Now, I'm a big fan of snags and deadwood. This really, really takes your habitat for birds to another level. Birds rely on deadwood in so many ways, and when we are removing deadwood from the landscape, we are limiting the amount of bird species that can benefit from these spaces. We have about 30 or so species of birds that nest in dead trees, dead and dying trees. So if you have a dead or dying tree on your property and you can leave it, great. If it's a hazard to your house or property or anything, if you can cut down part of it and leave part of it, it can still have a positive impact. If you have to cut it down, if you're able to reuse that dead wood in your landscape in some creative way, that's going to provide habitat still. And birds love to forage on deadwood because there's so many insects that seek refuge in deadwood and find habitat there. Um, and yeah, once it decomposes and breaks down, it's enriching the soil and supporting fungi and creating connectivity between plants, and so that's, I think, also really important. Um, and then also, yeah, instead of taking all of your dead wood and sending it to the landfill, repurposing it with, intentional brush piles, and you can have these hidden and incorporated into your landscape to maintain certain aesthetics, but you could also have it just out in the open. And yeah, you're going to get tons of birds using that as cover, especially in the wintertime. And it's a great place to look for sparrows and really interesting birds such as those. And so I don't know if I can. This video will play, but this was actually, I'll just pause it right there. This was in my yard when I moved in. There was this huge, huge privet tree in the backyard that had multiple trunks, and I got my friend to come over and we cut it down with the chainsaw, but we left a bunch of the portion of the stump remaining, as you can see in the right-hand picture. And I just treated that stump with an herbicide to kill the plant, but keep the wood there on site. And the rest of the wood, I created a large brush pile with. And then I removed all the English ivy and the monkey grass from underneath the tree. And I put down some cardboard and then put down some compost and mulch. And then I planted some native plants in there. And it has turned into a wonderful little pocket for birds and insects. And it has since evolved. Every time I have a big limb fall in my yard, I add it to this mess of stumps, and I have coral honeysuckle now growing through there. I have a small Chickasaw plum tree, and it's just this dense thicket of native plants and pollinator plants, and it has all these sticks on top. And so I get things like different birds coming and foraging in there, and it's been a real joy to see it evolve and see the different wildlife that has come to use it. For example. Oh yeah, here's a picture. You can see what it looked like before, as we cut it, and all the English ivy and monkey grass that I had to remove. It was quite the mess, but it has allowed me to see really cool things like this bird right here. And if you want, you could yeah, just think in your head. Does anybody know what kind of species of bird this is? You can put it in the chat if you want. But if I didn't have this little tiny native garden here incorporated into my landscape, I don't think I would have been able to get a picture of this bird this well, because some of you might be thinking this is an eastern phoebe, but it's actually an eastern wood pewee, which is a little less common than phoebes. They're migratory, so they're not here this time of year, but they are here and they breed in the summertime. And so this bird hangs out all the time in my yard, right at eye level, and I'm able to get these amazing photos because it comes down and it sits on these dead wood perches and it's foraging for insects amongst all the pollinator plants that I have planted. So it's really cool. It's a little bit smaller than a phoebe. The head isn't as big and blocky. It has slightly longer wings and slightly more bold wing bars, but it looks very similar and is closely related to the eastern phoebe. All right, so the wonders of water. Having water in your landscape can make a huge difference for attracting birds and other wildlife. And it can be as small as just a bird bath that you fill up and clean regularly. You could have a solar powered pump that pumps water over a rock like you see in the top left. You might already have a water feature like a pond or a river or a stream in your yard, or you could put in a small pond. But all of these features are going to increase the amount of wildlife that you see, and allow you to get better looks at some of these different kinds of wildlife. And if you can have moving water, that typically will help deter mosquitoes, but will also attract more birds. Typically, the sound of the moving water will bring them in, and they're most likely to come down and bathe. Um, and so. Back to the yard I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, my friend Richard Hall out in Athens, he put in a small water feature, and yeah, he's I think had around 30 species of warbler visit this little water feature. It's a small pond with recirculating stream. Um, and it's amazing the things that he sees. So yeah, if you're a birder, you might have heard of warbler neck, and that's when your neck starts to hurt after you're looking up in the trees for so long trying to identify a small warbler. But if you put in a water feature, yeah, you can get rid of warbler neck because the birds will come down to you. And so yeah, it can be really fun to add a water feature in some way into your yard, and it doesn't have to be big and fancy. I've heard of people hanging up a jug of water over a plate with a tiny little nick in the bottom so the water's dropping slowly into the plate, and that can get the birds coming in to bathe and other wildlife. So it's definitely a thing to think about. Now, of course, with all of this, when we are thinking about the landscape, native plants are really what make the difference. And certainly for birds, this is where it goes a really long way. I said habitat loss and habitat degradation are the leading causes of bird decline. When we're thinking about habitat degradation, part of that is a lack of native plants on the landscape. Native plants are adapted to our soils and our landscapes, and they are in sync with the birds. we have a lot of species of migratory birds, and when these migratory birds are moving across the landscape, they need specific kinds of food. And a lot of our native plants are producing fruit, right, as birds need them. Like spice bush, for example, is producing fruit in the fall when we have an incredible number of birds migrating through Atlanta. And those berries are ripening right when they need them, and they're high in fats that birds need to fuel their migration. Um, and so, yeah, it's really, really critical to focus and use native plants when you are birdscaping. And the more local, the better. That's what we typically recommend. And so there are resources like BONAP, which is Biota of North American Plants. Online, you can look up county maps for specific plants and see how, if a plant's native to your county. Georgia has poor data. So you kind of have to draw some inferences sometimes from nearby states, but it can point you in the right direction. And locally, the more local, the better, because these plants are going to be adapted to our climate and our soils and be best in sync with our wildlife. Um, and we like to limit cultivar and nativar use in our landscapes when possible, just because sometimes that can throw off some of the cues that wildlife and insects use to interact with those plants. And so, yeah, we're typically recommending straight species, but I don't think there's a perfect answer to that. Um, and then where to get native plants. There's so many different places. Like I mentioned, if you have native plants in your yard and your lawn that you let grow up, you could start to cultivate those plants and spread them out across your yard green space. There's a lot of great native nurseries around. Obviously, Trees Atlanta has a wonderful sale, and a lot of other places have great native plant sales. The Georgia Native Plant Society has native plant rescues, which are wonderful. And then down on the bottom right, I have a photo of Doug Tallamy and some of his books. So I'm really excited that Doug's coming to Atlanta to give a presentation at the office. And I would encourage you all to go because he's been an incredible advocate for this connection between native plants and birds and other wildlife and insects. And that whole dynamic between plants, birds, and insects is really what's fueling a lot of the health and decline in bird species. When we don't have native plants on the landscape, there's just less food for the birds. So yeah, here's some photos. Beach Hollow is a great native nursery, and we get plants from all the time. Here's our work truck after we went on a Georgia Native Plant Society plant rescue filled with bags of lots of plants that we were able to reincorporate to some of our restoration sites. And yeah, there are so many great, amazing, beautiful native plants. And so, yeah, I would just encourage everyone to try to get to know some native plants and looking for things on the landscape in our green spaces and parks and paying attention to things when they're blooming is kind of the easiest. It's like they're screaming at you, saying hello, and a lot of times it's easiest to identify new plants by their blooms. So. Some recommendations from a bird perspective on some plants to think about. The big hitters, when it comes to some herbaceous plants and trees and shrubs, for perennials, goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers and bonesets. I mean, they're incredible for hosting an amazing variety of insect life. Which, yeah, over 96% of our bird species feed their young insects, and so it's really important that we have plants on the landscape that can support a lot of insects. And then oaks, cherries, and willows are fantastic for hosting a variety of insects as well. And then I have some recommendations for a dry sunny spot, a wet sunny spot, dry shady spot, wet shady spot, and some honorable mentions. But yeah, some of these like Devil's Walking Stick is one of my favorites. It has an amazing bloom that attracts all kinds of pollinators, and then the fruit's ripening perfectly in time with the insects or with the migrating birds in the fall. And it can handle some nice dry soil on a sunny edge, maybe part shade, and it's really fantastic. Um, let's see, what else do I really like? Um, Jewelweed is awesome if you have a wet yard, a shady wet yard with little bits of sunlight. You can grow jewelweed, and it attracts hummingbirds like crazy in the fall. And there's some birds that actually come down, like rose-breasted grosbeaks, come down and feed on the seeds of jewelweed, which is pretty interesting. Um, if you want birds in your yard in the fall, yeah, Virginia creeper is amazing, but you will need to have an area where it can grow up something, flower, and produce fruit, because that's what the birds are really after, that fruit that Virginia creeper is producing. But there's so many good plants, and I could go on and on about the different plants that are great for birds. Um, National Audubon has a really great resource called Plants for Birds. You can type in your address or your zip code, and it recommends a bunch of native plants and some of the bird plant connections. So that's a fun thing to check out. I also wanted to highlight removing non-native plants is so important. So, in an urban space that has had a lot of disturbance and people coming in, obviously there's a lot of plants that have come in from other places, and they simply can't support the same wildlife that our native plants do. So, making sure that you are paying attention and learning about the non-native plants in your landscape and doing the things that you can do to remove or manage those. And if you don't have the time or the expertise, there's a lot of folks out there that do amazing work, and you could potentially hire to do work in your yard or green space. So there's a couple folks, Woodskeeper, Ecologic, Reforest ATL, and others are really good for that. And of course, Birds Georgia and Trees Atlanta have a lot of resources on that front as well. We have one resource that we created. It's a story map that matches certain non-native plants with native plant alternatives. That's on our website. That can be really helpful. Um, and then when you're birdscaping, maintenance is so important. So thinking about managing the native and non-native plants, but coming up with some kind of plan, spending time out there regularly, paying attention to what's happening in your green space can be really helpful and beneficial for you and save you a lot of work. Thinking about the phenology of different species, when things are blooming and going to seed, working on removing, stilt grass, for example, before it goes to seed is going to save you a lot of time and effort in the future. And so that can all be really important for maintaining the work that you do in your yard. And then I also want to mention the wildlife. If we are doing all this wonderful stuff to attract all kinds of wildlife to our yard, it's really important to make sure that we are creating safe spaces for them by minimizing pesticide use. From a bird perspective, some of the heaviest hitters in terms of threats they face are cats, outdoor cats. So keeping your cats inside is so, so important. Minimizing pesticide use, I mentioned, limiting outdoor lighting. Birds have a difficult time. They can be thrown off their course during migration with artificial lighting. And so minimizing that, especially in the spring and fall, and paying attention to potential window collisions. Birds have a tough time seeing glass. And so if you have a window that is getting a lot of window collisions, there's a variety of things that you can do to prevent that. Putting things on the outside of the window can help deter birds from running into those windows. And so, yeah, it's important to make sure that we are not only inviting wildlife to our green spaces, but making sure that they are safe when they are coming to those spaces. Birds Georgia has a Project Safe Flight program and a Lights Out program if you want to learn more about window collisions and lighting for birds. And now I also want to mention learning and connecting with others is like a huge part of this whole birdscaping experience. And so, making sure you're spending time photographing, just embracing, making observations of your green space, getting on iNaturalist and documenting what kind of life you have in your yard. Getting certified. There's so many great programs. Ours, Trees Atlanta's, Georgia Native Plant Society, and more are great ways to connect and recognize the efforts that you're putting in. And so, yeah, I think it's just, not only wonderful for you, but when you can share it with others, it becomes just that much more exciting. And then there's tons of resources out there for folks, a bunch of different great organizations. If you are a beginner birder, I want to recommend Merlin Bird ID app on your phone. It's wonderful for helping you identify and get to know birds in your landscape. And there's plenty of resources of native plants, getting to know them better. And I think. Lastly, yeah, getting more involved with Birch Georgia. We have for our wildlife sanctuary program, we have avian advocate volunteers who go out and do the certification. And so if you know a little bit about plants, you can get involved that way. You come out to some of our habitat sites and learn more about native plants and the habitat work that we're doing. We have a master birder program if you want to learn more about birds and become more comfortable identifying them. We have free field trips, and then our Bird Fest and Fall Flyway Festival in the spring and the fall are periods where we have a bunch of different events that are really fun and exciting. And I think with that, I am ready for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gabe. I took so many notes and I'm so excited about this. I want to do a quick let Colin speak for about 3 minutes and then we'll do Q&A for both of our amazing experts. So, Colin, if you are able to share your screen for a few minutes.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Gabe, for all the incredible resources and information. We want to extend a warm welcome again to all our birdscapers here today. I'm Colin Clayton. I'm the Trees Atlanta lead educator, education senior lead here at Trees Atlanta. And I've had the privilege of working with Elizabeth Beek to facilitate our City Forest Certified program. And I got to tell you from the bottom of my heart, this is such an awesome program. I see we have a lot of people here who have been certified with us, and so we're thankful to have you here. I just want to quickly walk you through some of the details of the program. So this is our latest community action program. You can get your home or your green space or, a local farm or garden certified with us. And we basically use this program as a means to provide you guidance and resources that empower you with practical knowledge and skills to make these changes in your community spaces and in your homes. Um, the vast majority of trees are located on private land here in Atlanta. So Trees Atlanta can go out and plant trees in public parks and in neighborhoods all day long. But it requires a network of people who are dedicated to making these changes in their own spaces to make true change in our city. So we can certify, like I said, like I touched on before, we can certify these different properties. You don't even need a yard to be certified, City Forest certified with Trees Atlanta. I would say that of the many certification programs that are available in our city, Trees Atlanta certification program is one of the most accessible, and we want to reward you for making lifestyle changes and for being active and for volunteering in addition to the changes that you make to your gardens and yards. So basically, some of the benefits for being a part of the program, you're going to receive a beautiful garden plaque, access to free resources, which I'm going to try to show you really quickly, invitations to special events similar to the Doug Talmy event coming up. We really hope to see some of y'all there. And 10% off of Trees Atlanta plant sales. So those of you who are asking about plant species that will work to support birds in your yards, you can take advantage of this coupon code to Trees Atlanta plant sales if you're certified with us. Basically, what I recommend you do if you're interested in getting your yard certified, review our online resources. I'm going to show you really quickly where that's at. So you can find us at treesatlanta.org/cityforest. All you got to do is scroll down here and come to list of
Oh,
goals.
wait, I don't think we can quite see it yet.
Y'all
So you
can't
might
see
have to,
the, okay, thanks for letting me
I
know.
can't see your screen. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah, it might require you to stop share and then reshare, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. One sec. Okay. So you can find us, sorry about that. You can find us at treesatlanta.org/cityforest and then come down here and go to this list of goal options. This is the big button you're looking for. Um, Resources up here. Most of us here are probably interested in certifying our residential properties, but here we have each of the goals. A lot of the program goals are perfectly in line with some of the things that Gabe was talking about today. Reducing invasive plants on your property, adding native plants to your property, leaving snags and cutting back on mowing. These are all things you can do as a part of our program. And so let's say I want to add some more native plants to my yard. All I've got to do is click on native plants. I'll click here for the instructions. And we have all of these documents available to you. We have lists and places where you can find these plants. And all this information is free. So I really highly recommend people utilize this stuff. If you want to take this to the next level and become a certified steward with us, it would be a matter of achieving specific goals for your property. We have 8 different stewardship tracks that we've partnered with different Atlanta organizations to create. One of them is a bird stewardship. Um, so we have all that information available on our website. And please let us know. You can reach out to us at City Forest Certified uh, at treesatlanta.org if you have any questions or if there's any way that we can support you in this journey. But thanks so much for your time. I'm going to turn it over to Beek so that we can get to some of your excellent questions here in just a moment.
Thanks so much. I'm going to jump back on. So thank you all for your questions as well. One of the first questions was a question about wanting to use more native plants at home instead of adding more feeders, and what plants serve a variety of insects and bird species. And I think Gabe and Colin, you guys both pointed out a number of great resources that are both on your websites and other resources that you have dropped into the chat. Is there any one or two or three that you want to just give a huge shout out for, or should I move on?
Yeah, I can really quickly say I love that idea. Native plants are the natural bird feeders on the landscape, and they don't require you to maintain them or clean them, so you don't have to worry about potential for spreading diseases. Um, and there's so many like the um, let's see, the willows, oaks, and cherries. Any of those trees are fantastic. The sunflowers, bonesets, asters are really great when it comes to perennials. And there's so many different options when it comes to those. But I also want to just highlight that it's not only the plants, it's some of those practices of keeping dead wood on the landscape and keeping leaves on the ground, because that leaf litter is what's feeding a lot of our birds in the wintertime, and not cutting down stems and grinding them up or sending them off in the yard waste bin. Because yeah, the seeds on our perennial plants are feeding birds through the winter, and then all the insects that are overwintering in the leaf litter are where our sparrows and thrashers are feeding during the winter time. So yeah, and you can go back and review the slide that I shared with plants, but there are so many good ones.
You. Another question that we had was whether or not hot bird food is okay for birds. And I think that's the type that discourages squirrels.
Yep. Yeah, so the idea behind that is birds have fewer nerves on their tongues, and so they can't feel the heat in the same way mammals do. And so yes, it's a safe and effective method for limiting squirrels' activity at feeders, although some squirrels have more tolerance than others and eventually get used to it, and sometimes they'll still go for it. But generally speaking, it does decrease the squirrel activity, and it's not shown to be harmful to the birds.
Thank you, Gabe. Somebody has a question about the piles of wood that have fallen from their trees, and um, they're interested in it using more wood and keeping that wood on their site, but their neighbors are concerned about fire, and they're wondering if you have any recommendations.
Yeah, I think doing what you can to process the wood and keep, brush piles in spaces as intentionally as possible, and keeping them maybe away from the house uh, can be ways to hopefully make people more comfortable. And once again, showing like the cues of care and the intentionality behind it. Um, And yeah, the more you break down that wood and kind of make it into a smaller pile, the more concentrated it will be, and you're still kind of having some of the benefits of having that wood on the landscape. Um, and so, yeah, that's kind of how I would approach it. Yeah, I think that's a tough one.
Um, Somebody else is curious if there are any wildlife beneficial plants that they could add to their small yard that can withstand the fact that this is also a kid's play space. Are there any really resilient?
Yeah, that's a good one. If it's the area where kids are like just running around actively, in terms of a ground cover that they are like recreating on, then honestly, having a lawn is actually pretty good for that because, yeah, it's super resilient and you can't really have too many wildlife benefits without letting something grow up. I will say what can be helpful is leaving leaf litter on the ground, because leaf litter can take all the, people running on it and stepping on it and can still provide some habitat for some insects and small things that birds and other things can forage on. So if you're referring to things that, yeah, people are actively stepping on, there are very few plants that I think are going to have the benefit that we want to get out of them from a wildlife standpoint, without being, mowed or trampled too much. There's things like path rush that can grow in places where people are actively stepping on it. But if it's an area where kids are recreating very regularly, then honestly a lawn might be your best option until the kids grow up or until you decide to do something different with the space. And if there are little marginal parts of that area where they don't spend as much time, maybe that's where you put in some native plants that can grow up and benefit the wildlife.
Thank you so much. Uh, Regarding snags or best slide, there was a question about how long the herbicide stays active when killing the privet, and would there be any potential harm to decomposing insects and therefore birds?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we recommend doing as much of your cut stump treatments with herbicides. So that's where you're cutting a woody plant and treating the stump, the cambium on the outer side of that stump, in the fall, because that's when a lot of plants are taking their nutrients down into their roots, and so that allows for the most efficient translocation of that herbicide down into the roots to kill the plant and then allow for that all to break down into the soil. And so, yeah, typically in the fall, if you're doing your cut stump treatment method, then you're going to minimize the amount of time that the herbicide is going to be available to, potentially harming anything. Um, but yeah, it's a very common and actively used practice that hasn't had any kind of demonstrated long-term effects on bird or insect populations.
Thank you. And somebody expressed a little bit of concern about ticks and mosquitoes, and they are wondering if a pond increases mosquitoes, and they asked if they can use the little donkeys.
Yeah. So the dunks are good, and we um definitely recommend if you have a pond or something like that, you can use the dunks. I know there's also a method where you get like 5 gallon buckets and put the dunks in there with some water and then also put some like vegetation in there. So that really attracts a lot of mosquitoes and will start to decrease them. Um, but you do have to be careful there to cover the buckets with something so that, wildlife doesn't get stuck in there and drown. Um, and then, yeah, a pond is definitely going to increase mosquitoes unless you can get the water moving. If you have some way of putting a pump or something, that'll decrease the mosquito activity. But yeah, if you can live with the mosquitoes as well, the mosquitoes are insects that a lot of birds eat, so it's something that can be beneficial, but obviously, yeah, there's somewhere where you might want to draw the line. So getting that water moving, using dunks and buckets, can be helpful for decreasing mosquitoes.
Thank you so much. And I have one last question, and then we're going to let folks go if they need to. But can you name an herbicide that is acceptable?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different herbicides that can be used, and it really depends on, what plant you're trying to treat or kill, and ultimately with herbicides, the label is the law. So making sure that you're reading the label and abiding by the label is critically important. But some of the most common ones that are used for cut stump method include glyphosate or Roundup, include triclopyr, is another really common one. And so, yeah, those two I think are widely used for a lot of these applications and can be done so effectively and safely if you are following the label.
Thank you so much. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to reach out to education@treesatlanta.org, and we will make sure that we pass it on to our amazing partners, such as Gabe at Birds Georgia, and get back to you with answers in writing. The recording will be on the Trees Atlanta YouTube, so you can rewatch it. And please check out some of the other events at both Birds Georgia and at Trees Atlanta. And thank you for also completing the survey so we can know how we did and how we can continue to serve you. Thank you so much for being here today, and huge shout out to Gabe and Birds Georgia and Colin. Thank you both so much for sharing today.
Thanks for having
Take
us.
care,
It's been
everybody.
wonderful.
Thank you guys. Goodbye.
Bye.